Hello, I'm Janet Sellery, Chair of the Event Safety Alliance Canada and Board Member of the Event Safety Alliance. I'm really happy that so many people have used the pause on live events to improve health and safety at their venues and their events. But there's always more to do, so thanks for joining us for this day of learning. We're really glad you're here.
Hello, welcome to Event Safety TV. I'm Danielle Hernandez.
I'm Steve Edelman.
And today we're going to talk about climate and live events and how we plan for live events and how climate change is changing how we plan for live events. We were workshopping the title, guys. You will know what we came up with before we do.
It's something about climate and weather and live events.
Yes.
So in order to have a coherent discussion, more coherent than our attempt to come up with a title, we have three smart friends with us. So our smart friends to join us for a conversation about weather, climate, and events are our friend Neel Vasavada, who is president and CEO of Overdrive Energy Solutions. Our friend Boxer Hardison, president of Bigger Hammer and co-founder of Overdrive Energy Solutions. And our friend Kevin Kloesel, university meteorologist of the Department of Campus Safety at the University of Oklahoma. So we have three smart friends, two board members, and Danielle and I kind of taking a back seat. The point of talking about weather and climate change in the context of events is because we don't want to lose sight of things that were important before the pandemic that remain important, perhaps have even a heightened importance now where we are at this stage of the pandemic as we, kind of peek around the corner towards whatever will be the next phase of normal. It's really important that we not lose sight of things that remain risks and hazards just because we're too focused on the shiny object of the day. So that's why we're talking about weather and climate change in the context of events. So with that attempt to tee up and contextualize the conversation, let's turn it over to Neel and Boxer and Dr. Kloesel. Gentlemen, take it away.
Yeah, Steve, one of the things that's really fascinating about climate is climate and this warming that we're in may make it easier to have outdoor events much farther into, for example, the winter or much earlier in the spring. And unfortunately, with the Waukesha event that occurred last night, based upon when we're taping this episode, the temperatures in Waukesha were a good 10 degrees above average, and that brings more people right out when your Thanksgiving week. So your risk goes up. The number of places that you might need for weather sheltering likely increases because you can certainly have more people and more outdoor events later into the winter, earlier in the spring. So it's not just the deep summer that we need to be worried about. We're getting into a realm where we can have outdoor events almost year round now, and people are comfortable going to those outdoor events. And so that's going to be something I think we see as we go forward. It wasn't just COVID, right? Where we're going outside more because we don't want to have indoor events, but climate is going to make it possible for us to be outside more. And what that means is that weather events within a climate change realm are going to be more and more impactful, right? Tornadoes.
Right, like the shed season, typically, spring, fall, or spring and summer and early fall. And you can see that getting stretched out, festivals, sheds, those are definitely stretching out because like you said, you can accommodate them.
Yeah, and so now let's take an outdoor event that we want to have in November in New England, and you're thinking about all the kinds of things that weather occur in New England in November, and probably record-breaking tornadoes is not on the list, but it just happened, right? So I think from a weather perspective, we're going to see kind of three main thrusts with our outdoor events. One, obviously heat, right? The heat issue is going to be an issue certainly in the depth of the summer. 2, severe weather occurring in places where maybe we haven't seen severe weather occur. And then 3, rainfall, right? Heavy rainfall rates that we're simply not used to. We're seeing this with inland tropical systems. For example, Hurricane Ida participating in canceling Bonnaroo this year. Those are the 3 places I think that we're going to see the most concern: the heat, the severe weather, and the rainfall rates. Those are kinds of the things that we're going to have to start planning around changes and differences in those.
Hey, Kevin, just to punctuate that, right? We what, a year and a half of COVID, and what cancels Bonnaroo the second year? It's not COVID, it's weather. The same old thing that's been canceling shows for years that's just going to get worse.
Right. And I think some of the things that we have to think about, Boxer, when we think about the kinds of impacts on events weather are going to have, it's not necessarily going to be the direct impact of weather. It's going to be some indirect events, so let's say you have a multi-day event, and the multi-day event is heat impacted. You're in the middle of a heat wave. Yes, the kinds of things we think about are, wow, we need to think about heat illness, and we need to think about more medical staffing, and we need to think about hydration. But the other thing heat does is it causes disturbances much more quickly, right? Behaviorally, people respond differently in very hot environments than when they are comfortable. And so tensions between patrons and those kinds of things, you tend to exacerbate the behavioral issues when it gets to heat. And I think we've maybe even seen some of that already this year.
Yeah, Kevin, there's a few other knock-on effects we've talked about too. Something that, when we're talking about pushing these events back, what about time? We're having more time in darkness. We're having more events end after dark. We're having more events, if you're out on the West Coast, subject not just to high temperatures, but big temperature swings during the event, during the day. So I think that although climate change, the direct effects are there, we need to look at how it's going to strain everything else, from sight lighting to walkways, even things like transportation.
And Neel, that's a great point, because transportation is also an issue with respect to one of those other risks that climate change is bringing us, the high rainfall rates, right? You're getting into a situation where you're flooding grounds, and you're having parking issues, and you're not able to get people moved from point A to point B, particularly if you need an evacuation for another reason, right? If you have some other threat, now weather becomes a multiplier for your threat and your impacts. And you mentioned, out on the West Coast, well, let's think about air quality, right? The high heat with more fires.
Was there something with air quality recently?
Yeah, those are the kinds of things that are going to make the planning part of the outdoor event industry. It has to be primary, and it can't be in a vacuum, right? You can't just do your weather plan in a vacuum outside of the behavior, outside of the air quality, outside of all of those things. They have to be comprehensive. And that is going to put a premium on the amount of time it takes to plan, right? You're going to need to spend more time planning because the risk profile is that much greater.
Well, we talk a lot about culture, when we talk about event safety. And I think that one of the issues here is there's so many encompassing factors. There's so many things that are affected, that really a big key lies in the cultural change, to get people to think about not just weather events, not just security, but how all of these things play together. And one thing I want to bring Boxer in on this, because he's done a very good job of making Bigger Hammer a sustainable business. Can you maybe comment on how some of the culture within can help us as event planners think of these things and these knock-on effects?
Well, I mean, I think culturally, it's similar to the way we think about safety, in that the true believers, the people that are listening to this podcast that come join us at the summit, are the people that believe in working safely because they care about people and they know it's the right thing to do. And so the same with looking to tackle the climate crisis is looking at what we're doing, what impact are we having, how is this going to affect people's lives, and that we need to act on it because, again, it's the right thing to do, and we can do it within our industry and, walk the walk and lead the way and help show people how it's done.
Okay, I'd like to pivot off that. So one of the things that I've noticed, even though there's increasingly water stations available at some of these outdoor events, there aren't quite as many as perhaps the crowd size would suggest. And they're still selling water for $7 a bottle because at the end of the day, they have to make money as well. So where is that line between the planning and covering costs at least, / making a profit? Boxer?
Well, I mean, it's a great point, and a little bit of pre-discussion for today that Neel and I and Kevin were talking about was, how do we shift that away from making water a revenue source and finding another revenue source? And it's of all things that COVID has exacerbated. I was just at the LA Auto Show yesterday, and half of the drinking fountains weren't working, probably intentionally because they forgot to switch them back on after everybody got freaked out about COVID. I know different campuses that I've been on have had cellophane or whatever over drinking fountains. They haven't really rethought that based on what we know now. But again, is how do we plan and take humanitarian things such as water out of it? I mean, I remember attending a Laguna Seca MotoGP race years ago, and there was, this is in Monterey, and it was about 95 degrees, and they're not equipped to deal with 95-degree temperatures in Monterey, and people were passing out in the crowd. And what was $5 water bottles became buckets of iced water given away to the crowd as they saw people start to, pass out from the heat. So rather than being reactionary toward it, we need to plan ahead for those things. But we can't ignore, the motivations of revenue as we look for solutions to these things.
Well, when we're talking about some of the effects of climate change, one thing we're talking about is essentially comfort, right? A reasonable temperature, a drink. And these are things that we have sold. We sell water, as we talk about. We sell VIP experiences. We sell shade in our business. So I'm wondering if any of you have or can think of anything where something that was once a revenue generator for our business had to change culturally to be something that's just a given, and how that went. Is there anything we can learn from it?
It's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, I'll chime in because something occurs to me right away, which is, in the auto industry, we used to have as an option seatbelts. And then when seatbelts became standard because they were mandated by the government, then airbags became an option until they became mandated. And safety measures, have always been dragged kicking and screaming from a revenue stream to something that people expected. I suspect that, without straining too hard, we can make the same analogy about magnetometers at the points of ingress to events, where initially they were scary and now they're expected.
Or maybe not revenue stream, as employers didn't always provide PPE, right? Now PPE is an expectation, not necessarily a revenue stream, but it's a cost nonetheless that is now expected to be provided and not a luxury or a rarity.
Well, this is one area. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Neel.
I was just going to say that, there's an opportunity within our industry. When we think of events, we often go straight to revenue generating entertainment, right? But there are lots of events that we serve that are driven by corporate conference, municipal events, things like that. And this is a place where we can there's value in demonstrating what's possible for sustainability. There's value for the people organizing the events and everything like that, to demonstrate these practices and get them going. And we can lead as an events company by quickly finding the places where we can enact some of these things that used to be revenue, and that's what cultural change is about. We start it in one corner and it moves across our industry, which I think overall is something. It's the only thing that's going to mitigate or going to make our industry resilient through this climate crisis, is moving these things from a corner of the industry to a best practice like safety belts. Last thing I'll say about that is I have a lot of exposure being an automotive engineer. There's a culture of efficiency and emissions among powertrain engineers these days. They go into work knowing that is their main, that's their main task, and I think we can do the same here.
Neel, that's spot on, because what you're describing is proactive behaviors are always less expensive in the long run than reactive ones. In the scenario Boxer just laid out a little bit ago, you had both the medical issues of people falling out, passing out, etc., then deciding by the seat of your pants on the fly, hey, we're going to give away water now, which is another, sort of hit on the revenue. If you had proactively mitigated against the heat with the water piece and the cooling piece to begin with, you wouldn't have had to spend all the money on the medical piece on the back end, because you would have prevented that in the first place. And we see that time and time again with weather, that proactive mitigation, although it might seem expensive on the front end, I know that, everybody thought, oh my God, we need a meteorologist and that's going to cut into our bottom line. And those guys are so damn expensive, and on and on and on. But in the end, a proactive weather plan and the ability to keep people out of harm's way becomes less expensive in the long run than winging it and having the disaster occur. So I think that when you think it through end to end, the proactive front end of this culture change that Boxer, you and Neel have both talked about, in the long run will be less expensive on the industry in a climate change environment.
And again, like risk assessment and risk mitigation, right? So what does it cost you to mitigate that risk versus what does it cost you to ignore that risk or to not deal with it?
Absolutely. And ignorance is always more expensive. And I think that's everywhere, right? New Orleans found this out with Katrina, right? The cost to protect New Orleans was huge. And everybody was like, well, gosh, that's a huge cost, so we're not going to do it. And then, of course, the worst case happens. And now it's 10 times more expensive to go back and try to respond to it than it would have been if you had mitigated against it. And we see that time and time again in weather of all types.
Well, climate crisis, right? What's the true cost of a gallon of gas? It's not priced into it. It's not even $5.50 or whatever the hell it is in California right now. That's not the cost of it environmentally. That's not what we're going to need to mitigate against for the next 20 to 50 years if we're successful. And so, if we take that long-term view and look at the entire cycle of what we're doing, we can mitigate those risks up front.
So you guys have reached the point where we are reaching in several of the other sessions as well, which is, okay, you've identified a problem. You've even identified long-term solutions, but how do you convince people? How do you speak to people who are interested in short-term solutions, who are just pissed off that gas costs $5.50 or some other ungodly figure, who just want to have it continue to be, as subsidized as it is because they want to drive their full-size pickup truck, which is gas-powered? How do you have that conversation?
Well, Neel and I have talked about this a bit, and exposing them to the technologies that are out there is if you're a muscle car person and I was talking to a production manager, shout out to Bill Ramey, and he has this Ford EcoBoost, which is a large diesel vehicle, or I guess gasoline vehicle, but it gets like 25 miles to the gallon or something compared to like 6 or 10 or whatever it would normally get. And so as you see that transition from, internal combustion to hybrid to battery electric, the power of electric motors, the instant torque, and those things are fun to drive. And so if you have that giant pick 'em up truck because you like the power behind it or whatever. Is like, there's a lot of really cool things about the technologies that are involving. So I think what we've talked about is getting little wins, getting exposure, and making people comfortable with the technologies that are coming on board.
Yeah, and just to underline what Boxer's saying, that's a big part of this is exposing people. So what we're doing on the energy side is exposing people to energy technology that people who might be skeptical and people who might not have seen the technology can see that it's a net enhancer. It's not just about climate change. It can be a net enhancer. But I mean, on this kind of thread, Kevin, you've been dealing with this longer than any of us have. And in fact, I mean, meteorology, gosh, you guys used to be just the folks that were pretty on the Weather Channel. Now you're like the first line of defense, and everyone's saying that this, which you have studied all your life and you know is inevitable, is going to screw up their groundwater supply or their beach houses or anything like that. How does meteorology deal with this? How do you guys deal with that cultural change and that skepticism against the things that you know are true?
Yeah, the skepticism is awesome, right? Because we're always accused of being wrong. And we'll take that because you do not want us to be right. Because if we are right, you got a problem. And we're seeing ourselves with the technology we have at our disposal. That information has gotten better and better and better. And now we're in that realm of, for example, telling people about Miami flooding on a clear sky day because of sea level rise. And that just happened this past week again, right? On the same day that Congress is looking at, the infrastructure bill, and I'm going to hammer on the Florida delegation, right? Which is all voting no. At the same time, Miami is underwater under clear skies, right? It's like at some point, the impacts to the individual. And that's really what it takes, right? You have to be impacted personally before you tend to act. And our role is to try and get people to act before they're impacted personally. But as the one by ones, as you start to see more and more people impacted, COVID was the same way, right? People were like, well, I'm not so sure about that, et cetera. And now suddenly your aunt, your uncle, your parent, you have a death in the family, right? These are tragic things. But unfortunately, sometimes it takes that to get us to a point where we act proactively. And the weather's not going to stop doing this, right? The weather is going to continue to make a very visible impact on our events across the board, across the country, right? Whether it's flooding rains, intense heat, severe weather, all of these things are going to continue to occur. And at some point, I would much rather have my friends out here in this industry, learn at the expense of others, and hopefully nobody is learning at your expense.
Well, I think that, my dad used to love to say you could bring a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And you got to think of that in a deep Indian accent. But really,
Neel, it's at the point where we're going to need to make them drink because heat is going to be the big issue where they're going to die from it.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we talked about leading up to this call, I think is important, is in terms of mitigating climate change, and preparing for the effects of it default in our events, we have to start making things that weren't given a given, things like water and shade, sustainable transportation, sustainable local food members, all this stuff. But at this point, it's going to cost more. But the point is that when that horse finally drinks, whatever happens, God forbid, it has to happen to get people's attention. We will be ready with solutions. We can lead the way as as an industry which has outsized impact. And that is one huge thing we have to remember, especially when we're dealing with, structures or something like that in event safety. It can be sort of insular. This is how we do it, where we do it. But when we're talking about climate change, we're talking about changing the world. We're talking about doing the things that the music industry has done time and time and time again. And from a production standpoint, from a science standpoint, and everything like that, we don't think about how what we're going to do is going to affect the practices of this 12-year-old fan who's going to our shows and how that's going to change their relationship with climate change. But this is super important. And so even though we might not be the ones that can convince all the hearts and minds that this is something they gotta They got to be ready for it. We can, as an industry, develop the messaging and the solutions so that when the inevitable, unfortunately, happens, which a lot of us, it's pretty clear at this point, it's happening. We are ready for it.
Yeah,
Well, Neil, I just want to, sorry, Kevin, just tack on to that is we work backstage, right? We wear black when we're pushing boxes, and we don't like to, we're not out in the front. But what we need to do is we need to bring all of the star power of our industry, and we need to ask those rock stars, everybody to step up and lean into it. And we have to use that megaphone, and we got to get people involved. And it just, it may be uncomfortable for us who are used to, working in the shadows, as it were, but to reach out to those connections and bring them out to the front to where we can get the audiences and everybody else who's enjoys the work that we do, to amplify that message and help be part of solving this.
Yeah, Boxer, and I was going to echo exactly what you said, because it's not just the event personnel and the planning. It takes the entirety of the community. It takes the artists as well. I sit here and think about, how many times I've had Applebee's running through my head on a date night because of Walker Hayes. If we had more and more artists sort of involved in the communication of this risk, I think it would go a lot more quickly, because the fans of those people would then start working with those artists and understand that, wow, this person that I go to concerts and I see that person talking about it, therefore I maybe need to do that. I think the artist community here is going to be key in how this gets communicated going forward.
And I want to add also is, we were some of the first industry to have LED fixtures out in the field, right? To have in lighting fixtures, to have jumbotrons that have gotten bigger, brighter, lighter over time. So we need to be the early adopters. We need to take on that technology. We need to be pushing these technologies forward in our industry and take small pieces of it, get little wins, get people familiar with it, and be part of improving that technology and getting in front of everyone.
Well, one of the things that I like about this conversation and the way it's going is we're basically talking about two parallel things at the same time. One is getting little wins, which is essentially changing the culture conversation by conversation. And the other is, going for the occasional home run with things like getting artists who have massive outsized influence and bully pulpits to change culture much faster. They're both important, and they can happen simultaneously. They're not mutually exclusive at all. I think what we've so far mostly concentrated on are the smaller wins. And Kevin, one of the things that I have loved and admired about you for many years is how you can simultaneously talk about meteorology and events, and there's no clear line, which means we understand what you're talking about. And, I'm an arts and humanities guy, just like most of the people who will be watching this conversation. And yet you make meteorological science understandable in a way that I care about. So it seems to me that that's kind of the message for our individual conversations, the small wins, but also when we have the ear of people who have the big megaphone, that's the same conversation we have to have with them to get them to buy in, because it relates, the climate change, the meteorological science. Those messages resonate for something that they care about, and then we motivate them to action as well.
If you're, sorry, Neil, just to make it quick. If you happen to be a business owner or someone who affects change in your organization, are you using solar? What effect can you have on your organization? Or if you have access to people with a lot of eyeballs on them or a lot of dollar signs on them, what can you get them to do to affect their organization or that artist or the tour that's going out or the event that they're having? I mean, we need to have a call to action to everybody in the ESA, in our industry, is to go out and start having those conversations and asking and getting action on this stuff. Go ahead, Neel.
Yeah, well, Boxer actually is good follow-up to that. Yes, everyone in our industry, right? And this group tends to be production focused. This may be, at least in my time here, one of the biggest initiatives where we have to start involving the artists directly. You know, this is of everything that we do. Artists are kind of at the end of the line. They're the, you know, when the house lights go on and the performance starts, that's when the artist kicks in. Here, you know, does CAA have a meteorologist, or do they have the ear of one? How do we get agents and tour managers, and again, people who are more facing the talent, the people who can get us those big wins with their bully pulpits and all that? Is this a new frontier for us, or is this just a more of a one we've already had?
I think there's a parallel to safety, right? As we started to see insurance companies or promoters or artists write in standards for crowd management or structures, when it's top down, when it is the paycheck, aka the artist or the person who's, you know, making the event happen, saying, in order for me to do this event, you need to do X, Y, and Z, you know, that's when we'll start seeing these changes in mass, right? And so our job is to get those in those positions to incorporate practices in their requirements to do events.
Okay, so I've heard two tracks as well. One is we have this current hazard, how weather affects our thing, that we have to plan and accommodate for, and it may cost us more money to plan for it, but it'll cost us way less money than if we have a big crisis at our event. That's one. The second is culture change, which we're wholeheartedly behind because that's how change happens for real. I've heard a lot of have the artist adopt the technology. These are real big picture things that I think are great. What about individuals? What behaviors can people take and emulate? Because something this year I'm trying to embrace for myself is progress over perfection. If I'm waiting to do something when it's perfect, I'm never going to do it because I can't fix climate change by myself. But what can I do? What can a small event do? Boxer, I see your hand up.
Yeah. So like with our conversations about safety, about diversity, and about sustainability, it's the lens through which you have to look at everything that you do. So we didn't have any bigger hammer shirts made for the last year and a half. And normally those are just made throughout the course of the year as we get them out to crew. And so, hey, guess what? Somebody flipped on a light switch and every event in the world is happening. So, okay, let's go and get new shirts made. Well, I want to have sustainably made shirts that are either organic cotton or a mix of recycled materials, supply chain, constraints. So I could go get the shirts off, the polyester, non-organic cotton shirts that are, more readily available. But I asked myself, is it worth an extra couple bucks a shirt to get them to be organic cotton and recycled materials? To me, it is. So that's what I do. Changing a landscaper. Hey, can you use these electric battery operated landscaping tools when you service bigger hammers property, right? As opposed to a two-stroke edger and blower, right? So it's about it's not super sexy, a lot of it, but what's your job? What can you personally affect? When you make those choices, push the choices that reflect your values.
Yeah,
So
I think that goes without saying. Something else we're talking about here, then the joiner between these two tracks are those small wins. What can we do now? Like, we've talked about water and shade a couple times here. That can help us with climate resiliency, will help us deal with the changes that are happening with the weather on the ground today, and also fuel a cultural change. Also help motivate people, give them tools, whatever, to act or to seek events with more sustainability, maybe to take some of that home with them. Where do we connect those two? Again, it's, I think, starting with the small wins.
So I'm going to suggest something which is, a useful feature about this conversation, which is the chat function. So for those of you who've been watching this conversation and feel like there's something that you can do, put it in the chat. Because what we're talking about here are small wins that are individually focused, and they're going to depend on your own circumstances. Put them in the chat, inspire other people who are watching this with your good ideas, and they'll do the same for you. And then, here's a takeaway homework assignment for you guys, I suppose, particularly Boxer and Neel, which is, let's compile these good ideas, the ones that you've referenced here in this conversation, as well as any that appear in the chat, and let's put them out as an ESA document, an interactive one that will grow, so that as people have conversations, they have more to work with. The limits of our list is the limit of our own creativity. So let's create another living document, which is sort of the ESA way anyway. You've identified a problem. You've identified some good solutions. Let's get it started and see how our list grows and how we can all use it together.
Sounds like a good challenge.
All right, we're wrapping up this episode of Event Safety TV. Does anybody, Dr. Kevin, what final thoughts do you have for us?
I think what Steve just said is spot on, because you want to be the agent for change, right? Every individual who's watching this, because if you allow the weather or the climate to be the agent for change, you have waited too long. And in this sort of facing the increased heat, the increased rainfall rates, the increased and different severe weather patterns that we're already experiencing, if you wait for that, you've waited too long.
Neel, what about you? Final thoughts? You're muted.
We almost got through it.
I almost got through it.
Almost got through it. This is a lever, and we have the opportunity to work on the issue at hand right now that's affecting our events, and work on the greater world, something that live entertainment's always been good at. And I'm looking forward to us standing up and taking a role at helping mitigate this climate change.
And Boxer?
Just to circle back and to challenge everyone listening to this to go out and ask, who can I bring along with me, and what can I personally do?
All right. Well, those are all great. I'm inspired. Thank you all very much for your expertise today and some really great thought-provoking ideas. And everybody out there, we'll see you in the chat. And we're looking forward to joining with you again on our next episode of Event Safety TV.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.